Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm also a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rob and I are back at it for our weekly chat. Rob told the French people in his co-working space that we were trying to record a podcast, but they gave him a really appropriate, or I guess an expected amount of French courtesy that you might admire. So our producer will do his best to clean up some of the noises from the first 20 or 30 minutes, but if you hear some strange noises, that's what's going on in the background there, and we are working on figuring that out. Otherwise, you can write to me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you have any questions about this podcast or want to talk any more about what we do at CI or really anything else. Other than that, cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Rob and I have some interesting stuff to talk about today, but I would feel remiss, in part because our podcast producer said we should come on and talk about the Turkey earthquake, not to just say it really sucks. It's really tragic what's going on in Turkey right now. The death, and in Syria, the death toll is over 19,000. I don't have much to offer in the ways of geopolitical insight. Erdogan has declared a state of emergency right up until elections in May. The cynic in me says that's a little weird, but I also don't think this is the right time to be talking about that because things are so bad. So I don't want the listeners to think we're not paying attention to it. It's really awful. I would also point out there's tons of awful things happening around the world literally all the time. There were landslides in Peru this week. There's a famine in the Horn of Africa. Like, it's interesting what the media chooses to focus on. But I did want to just start off by saying we know that the Turkey earthquake's happening. It's really, really terrible. We feel tragic about it. And, you got to get through the day however you can. I usually rely on irony and jokes, which is probably inappropriate, but hey, you guys listen to this podcast. So there we go. Anything to add, Rob?
No, I think you covered it. Covered it pretty well.
All right. Well, if I know there are some Turkish listeners out there, so in all seriousness, I don't know that we can do anything, but know that you're at least on my mind. Rob, you wanted to pick up where I left off on the China balloon rant that I had earlier this week. So why don't I just tee you up and say, jump on in, and then we'll get to it.
Yeah, well, I thought the rant was well done, and sometimes it's important to point out when things aren't very important. But the thing that caught my eye was when you were talking about what the balloon would be observing in the U.S. as it flew over the U.S. And
Rob, not to mess up your flow, but the United States government, I believe, and intelligence community did say today that they claim that they have evidence that there was equipment on the balloon that would have allowed Beijing to collect signals intelligence. So this is not abstract. They could actually see all the things that we're going to talk about that they could see in the United States. So there you go.
Well, that's a scary thought, isn't it? Yeah. So really, I wanted to focus on the things that are more what I would describe human capital in what you spoke about, which is obesity, healthcare, educational levels, the performance of schools, that kind of thing. And I thought we could take this episode to sort of use that term human capital as a theme or a hook to hang some discussion on, because when I look at markets and what's happened in the last week since we last spoke, really the big development, and from week to week, there aren't many big developments usually, but there was a big development in the last week. And what we saw this really unexpectedly strong payrolls number. We saw really strong wage growth. All of these signs that the Fed has been talking about in terms of, wage inflation, labor tightening. This was a big confirmation of all of their fears, in short. And the markets recognize that. So the euro, as we've been talking about all year, has been going up, 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 up. And it really broke out to a new high above 110 heading into this print. And boy, did it get slammed It went down from 110 to 107 in a hot minute, and that's a big move for the euro. So likewise for bonds. So last week we talked about how when you see these divergences across different types of asset markets, it's usually worth paying attention. So bond markets had been telling us, oh, things are slowing down. We're heading into a recession. Yields are tightening. They're going down. Whereas the stock market was saying a completely different story. They were saying, hey, inflation is picking up. It's accelerating, because the sorts of stocks that have been doing very well, home builders, commodities, steel, that kind of thing, are cyclical stocks that do well early in the cycle, not late in the cycle. So what gives? And in this last week, what you saw was that resolved itself a little bit, because the bond yields that had been coming down, all of a sudden jumped up 30 basis points on that print. And now bond traders are speaking very differently about what the Fed is likely to do over the medium term, over the next few quarters. And likewise, all of those cyclical stocks that had been ripping ever since the Chinese reopening trade started to gain momentum, all of those fell flat on their face in the last week. And they're still up a lot. And the euro is still up a lot. And Chinese equities are still up a lot. And this whole trade has, this is one bloody nose in the middle of a fight. But it's a really noteworthy bloody nose. And it might be the beginning of that narrative that we've been talking about really all year in 2023, starting to roll over and turn around. And the reason why I say this is about human capital is because in the US, what the Fed is worrying about and what has bloodied the nose of this rally is signs that we're running out of people, we're running out of workers, we're running out of human beings to do the jobs that we need to do. And that is largely a function of these issues that you're talking about, that the balloon is surveying, obesity rates, disability rates, drug addiction, birth rates are declining, death rates are rising, even outside of COVID. These are major, major problems, and they're not hypothetical problems for the future. This is stuff that is hitting markets right now. So it's worth talking about more than the balloon.
It is worth talking about more than the balloon. How do you, you when we were talking to prep the podcast, you had an interesting list of countries that the United States was similar to in terms of its human capital. So how do you benchmark the challenges that, say, the United States is having versus other developed economies are happening? Because we've been hearing about declining birth rates in large parts of the developed world for a long time now. Everybody's talking about Japan's population is shrinking. China's demographics look absolutely terrible. So what about this in the United States worries you maybe versus some other markets that would also have some of these problems?
The biggest issue in the US, and I don't have all the numbers in front of me, but the biggest issue is really the health-related one. It's not the births. The births are going down, but they're still okay relative to other countries globally. It's the deaths that's the problem. And arguably, this is a bigger short-term problem because people who get sick and can't work today, they have a problem today. That's a problem for the economy today, whereas fewer births is a problem that emerges in the future as the next generation is entering the workforce. So if you look at a place like Europe, depending on which country you look at, birth rates are generally a little bit lower than the US. That's not the case in a country like France, for instance, where the birth rate is slightly higher now. But the US is sort of at the high end of the European range. The issue is life expectancy. So here are the US's peers, just to put this in context, because a lot of people kind of know this, but they don't really know this. So the US's life expectancy on average grew more slowly than its peers from 1980 until, today. And it peaked back in 2014 at 79 years. So we're still below the 2014 peak in life expectancy. And that's, forget about COVID. This is before COVID. Now that's really bad. Now let's look at comparisons, right? So life expectancy in the US peaked at 79. In Japan, it's 85. In most of Western Europe, France, Italy, Spain, where the food is good and people live a relaxed lifestyle, it's 83, 84. In Slovenia and Greece, it's 82. So Slovenia and Greece are 3 years ahead of us. Whereas the countries that are on the same level as us, let's look at our peer group at 79. There's Lebanon, there's Thailand, there's Estonia, and there's Albania. So sort of a weird, like if that was your World Cup group, you might be excited, but otherwise, I don't think it's company that you necessarily want to be with.
2014 seems like a weird sort of peak year in lots of ways when you look at it, because it's when the first Russia-Ukraine, I guess, situation happens, and Russia takes over Crimea and Donbass. It's also, if you go back and look at trade globalization and trade figures, they all start wavering around 2014. It's when protectionism starts rearing its head in lots of different parts of the developed world. I don't know what it is about that 2014 year. It's also the year, oil prices sort of fell through the bottom there around 2013, 2014. And then we had really low oil prices for a long period of time, which arguably helped us get to the current energy crisis today. So, that's kind of tangential to what you're talking about. But, and I know that correlation is not causation and things like that, but it does seem like as the world has gotten more volatile, like I don't know what's reflecting what there, but a lot of stuff seems to happen in 2014 from a trend level, and I can't really explain it.
Yeah. In some ways, it seems like I shouldn't say things started to go off the rails, because I think that's been a progressive process for a very long time. But certainly things have been accelerating since then. I think you can attribute the decline in the U.S. To drug overdoses, because if you look at the causes of deaths, I forget the term. It's like unidentified accidents is a big category. That's the number 3 killer in the U.S. Number 1 is heart disease. Number 2 is cancer. Number 3 is random crap. And within that category is drug overdoses, car accidents, all the things that happen when you have bad behavior and problems. And that group has been growing. The thing that's really striking about this is I was looking at the death rates through cancer, and they're actually down by almost a third since 2000. So number 2 on the list is down by a third. And still, everything else has risen sufficiently to more than offset that, which is really not good.
Yeah, it's funny. I was also telling you this before we got on the podcast. I got some interesting feedback on the balloon podcast rant, as you do when you start ranting about things. And a very good friend, shout out to you, Mark. First of all, I appreciate you starting your email with just checking on you. Are you okay? Because it was fairly dark. And I'm like, don't worry, I'm chilling. I'm my usual self. But and he and I have already gone back and forth about this a little bit. But he brought up, don't forget about the great employment numbers. Don't forget about home ownership rates. Don't forget about all the other good things that are happening in the United States. And I wonder how you would respond to that, Rob. I know that I responded back by, in some ways, making it a little bit generational, which is to say that, and I wonder if this fits into the 2014 argument that we're talking about here. Something also happened with the 2008 financial crisis, because the 2008 financial crisis is also when, people, I think, lose, maybe that's the beginning of the loss of faith in the globalization economic model. It's the beginning of really, over a decade's worth of really cheap money and low interest rates, and we never really normalized the situation after that. And then you also, though, have a generation that came of age after 2008. And I'm in that generation, so I feel it rather acutely, where not only did you not get a full recovery, you then got a pandemic right on the heels of it. So if you were coming of age, if you're a millennial who was coming of age around 2008, your experience of the world is, economic crisis, Xi Jinping takes over China, geopolitical competition, and then global pandemic, and you're just never really getting ahead. And I wonder if there's this sort of twin thing happening where, loose money just allowed 10 years of excess and people to do whatever they want. And at the same time, the younger, more productive part of the population that was supposed to be taking over the mantle kept on getting beaten down because there was crisis after crisis and all these structural issues that never got fixed. And you just sort of get this malaise of people, to your point, who they don't want to work. Why should they want to work? Like, it's like you have to work multiple jobs just to just to go pay for daycare, which costs an arm and a leg, and then you're basically sending all of your money direct to daycare. Why don't you just stay home and, buy some Dogecoin or something like that? I'm exaggerating for effect, but I wonder how you would respond to the rejoinder that, there is an element of truth to it. Like, the United States is extremely wealthy. Like, there are parts of the country, either at a generational level or even at a geographic level, that are doing extremely well. So how would you pick apart that response, which is to say, stop worrying about all the bad stuff. There's good stuff going on in the US too.
I think it's a tale of two cities response. I think you have to be looking at the far end of the distribution on the positive side and being extremely optimistic. I don't think I've ever been more optimistic about high-performing, intelligent young people and their ability to do great things in the U.S. in the period that I've been alive. Mm-hmm. When you look at what's going on with, the way that the internet is bringing people together and providing role models for them in a self-reinforcing way and creating communities that span geography, and what some of these young people are doing, I think you have to look at that, and that's where the good news is. Like, we are going to absolutely kill it on the top 5%, top 2% of performers. And I think when we think about superstars, like, the superstars are going to be super duper duper stars in the next 10 to 15 years. And that's really important, just thinking globally, because, I apologize for the background noise here.
You're fine.
These guys are always like, I told them before, I was like, hey, I'm going to record. Can we keep it quiet? And they're just like, oh.
Vive la France. This is why they live to 82, Rob, and why you and I live to 79 and declining ages, because they don't give a fuck. And
not giving a shit adds 3 years to your life.
Yeah, I'm trying to enhance that. Jacob, we're keeping this in the podcast. Don't delete that part. Anyway, pick up where you left off.
Oh, where was I? So yeah, the super duper stars. This is really important globally, because I think you're starting to see, and this is speculative, you're starting to see evidence of that beneficial aura going across the borders, and the high-performing, high-educated people in all sorts of geographies all over the world, and mimicking the people in the US, the people in Silicon Valley, and that's extremely powerful. But that's a different topic we can get into in more detail. That's the good news. I think I would push back on sort of the optimistic view, however, when you talk about the median person, because I think the median person is much worse off than is commonly assumed. And I wouldn't necessarily tie it to 2008. I think 2008 is sort of a very obvious manifestation of that. Mm-hmm. But if you really look at some of these numbers, I think you have to go back to the year 2000. And the one that always catches me is, in the year 2000, the US had 17 million people who worked in manufacturing. And think about, if you don't have a high education, what do? You do something with your hands, by definition, right? And, my parents and grandparents, they worked with their hands. And that's where everyone comes from, and work your way up. So in 2000, we had 17 million people working with their hands. Currently, we have 12 million people who work in manufacturing. The problem is, over that time period, the US has added more than 50 million people in population. So we've completely decimated the population of people who can make a living by working with their hands and making things. And if you look, not to bring China into this, but the biggest drop came immediately after China joined the WTO. Mm-hmm. And we know that story. But really, the issue here is, what do those people do? What do you replace that with? Well, over the same period, what are the areas that have grown? It's healthcare and social work, which is basically home health aides, nurses, people taking care of the sick people. That's been the growth industry of the US. Over the same period that we've lost 5 million manufacturing jobs, healthcare and social services have added 8 million. So it's more than a 1-for-1. And then the other big one is leisure and hospitality, primarily drinking places, because hotels have not changed at all during that time period.
Yeah.
So we're talking about people who are working at Chipotle, people who are working in restaurants, people who are serving you beers and food. Those are the people who previously would have been making things manually, and now they're making burritos manually. So that's the human capital that we've been building for the last 20 years. And it's no wonder if you look at, everyone knows this, but the labor force participation, how many people who are of the age to work actually are participating in the labor force, it's in long-term decline. And it peaked right at that point, right in 2000. In 2000, 75% of men who are of the age to do so worked. Now it's 68%. Even for women, it's gone down, despite the fact that more and more women were entering the workforce, because of social progress and women's liberation. In 2000, it was 60%. Now it's 57%. So this is the big problem. And when people talk about comparisons to Europe or Japan, for instance, yes, they have slower growing populations, older populations on average, but they don't have these problems. And they have labor market slack. They have a lot of people who are not working, who are in the labor market, who are trying to find work. A lot of young people who aren't working because it's harder to get into the system there. Here, we're desperate to get anyone who can sling a burrito. And that's a more intractable problem.
You paint a pretty grim, that's a pretty grim view of kind of the position of the United States. And so I wonder, well, I guess there's two questions. I don't know if you watched the State of the Union. I actually didn't watch the State of the Union, but I watched the section where Biden was talking about, again, where he was going to do Make in America, sort of make it a big thing. And he's been saying that for years, but it sounds like he's now going to require that, all the materials that go into federally funded U.S. infrastructure products have to be made in America. So the concrete and the fiber optic cables, he went down a whole list. It was like LeBron James going, not 5, not 6, but it was fiber optic cables and concrete and blah. But the tongue-in-cheek cynic in me was sort of like, do I want to drive across a bridge that was made in the United States? Precisely to your point, like things that are made in the United States, do I trust the quality of those things? Like we can rag on China all that we want, but another thing that's happened since the pandemic and since supply chains to China got all screwed up, have you noticed that your appliances aren't working as well? Have you noticed that they're not as available? Have you noticed that suddenly things and brands that you thought were totally reliable are not totally reliable? Because we can't attribute that all to moving away from China and things like that, but we all did profit sort of from China's globalization tool. So anyway, I got a little off track there. What I'm trying to ask is, it's a grim picture because that's not the sort of thing that can be fixed quickly. Like the White House can't snap its finger and say, we're only going to buy U.S. concrete and U.S. fiber optic cables. We have to have companies that make fiber optic cables and are prosperous making fiber optic cables and all these other sorts of things. And the entire economic logic of the world since the collapse of the Soviet Union was doing things efficiently. Who can make the fiber optic cable at the best quality at the least price? And that's still not going to be the United States. So, how does the United States get out of that pickle that you're talking about there? I guess immigration is one path, but I wonder if you feel like you're laying out something that is just kind of already baked in and like we're going to have to live with that here for the next 5 years, or if you think there are actually things the United States could do to turn the Hindenburg around, to bring it back to where we started.
Bad analogy. Jeez. Well, I think there's two issues there. The first is the aggregate one, which is how many humans do you have to do this work? Like, okay, and you're going to put through $1 trillion infrastructure bill. That's great. Where are the people going to come to actually do the incremental jobs? Because right now there's no unemployed people who are able and willing to work. And we've just had the biggest wage boost acceleration in our living memory. It used to be at the start of the pandemic, you could go and work at a bar and make $12 an hour. Now you can make $22 an hour in some cases. And yet the labor force participation rate is still below pre-pandemic levels and still in long-term decline. So what are you going to do to attract these people? The number of construction workers in the US is basically at the same level that it was in the year 2000. Where are the people going to come from? How are you going to build, fiber optic cable and, bridges and roads and solar panel fields and like assuming you can get the permitting, which is a whole nother discussion. But they're treating, and this is something you see in investing and like if you look at macro history a lot, like they're fighting the last war. The last war was we didn't have enough demand, right? Interest rates had to be low because you needed to just get anyone to do anything, like anything for demand. Just build it, whatever. Build houses in the middle of the California desert, like whatever. Just build it. We need that demand. And now we don't have that problem. We have more demand than we can handle. They passed this stimulus bill, and you can see it right now. You can see it. The U.S. demand is accelerating beyond what we can supply, and inflation is probably re-accelerating if you look at sort of forward measures and what's happening with labor supply and demand and things like that. So they're trying to fix the supply problem with demand-related solutions. I think that's the first one. And the other issue, as I said, there's two issues, not only the aggregate issue, but also the human capital issue. So as you point out, like we want to build semiconductors in the US, like we don't have people who know how to do big parts of that. Like you can't have generational outsourcing and then expect to be able to do things anymore. I was talking with Miles, who was the guest on the show recently, and he was saying, oh yeah, I forget exactly what we were talking about, but some specific process within nuclear fission. And I said, oh, well, like, why don't they just do a lot more of that? And he said, well, no one in the US has known how to do that for like 50 years. And just the concept of us forgetting how to do something is really shocking. But that's the reality. So it's not a short-term fix that I can see unless you can think of something and unless you start becoming more open to immigration.
Well, what we really need is guys like Miles to figure out nuclear fusion, and for biotech companies to create pills that can cure cancer and also end addiction and cure give you the same effect of eating sugar. I don't know. Like there are as you get all these problems, I think you're right. Like when you look at places like the biotech sector or like the energy sector, there are all these places that are really interesting, and maybe you could drive down costs for some of these things. It's also, there's a little bit of golden age syndrome here, which is, we've forgotten how to make, medieval Gothic cathedrals. Nobody in the world could do that today. No, I don't think people know how the heck the Egyptians made the pyramids. Like there's some speculation about that things, but we forget the things that we generally, I guess, don't need. So I think you could teach people to do these things, and you could invest in some of these things. It's also interesting when you look around the world, and I like the theme of human capital, because in some ways it is a contest for human capital. We've been keeping a close eye on Italy for a long time, obviously from an investment perspective, and also because they have that interesting, I don't know what to call her, if she's populist or center right or fascist. She sort of checks all the boxes. But she came out this week in a statement and said she wanted Italy to use funds from the European Union to wean itself off of Russian gas and become a clean energy hub for the future. Like that's a politician that people were calling a fascist is saying, I want to take EU money to make Italy like a clean energy capital of the world. Like that's, I don't know what to do with that sort of thing. You also get, if we even go to really far-flung places of the world that nobody pays attention to, like Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan have been talking lately about how they can improve relations between the two. And what they're going to do is they're going to give people national ID cards and let them travel back and forth between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. And nobody gives a shit about that. But if you can get the human capital going across those borders, maybe you can at least make smaller markets, and then you can kind of go from there. Oh, they make something interesting on the Uzbek side of the border. I'm going to bring it over here, et cetera. If you go to other places of the world, like one of the real problems with Peru is also, when you get down to it, is human capital. You've got people who are in the cities hanging out versus the people who actually bring the stuff out of the ground versus the actual people who are building things. And none of those populations are working in the same direction. And that's part of the reason that the entire population is at odds with each other. So you kind of look around and the fight for human capital really is out there, really is rich. And it's, I don't know. The United States has some advantages when it comes to that sort of thing, but that advantage has always been being able to attract the best human capital from other countries who don't want to stay in their own countries. They want to come here and do all sorts of things in the United States. And I guess that's still true, but I don't know. It's a difficult future going forward, you know?
Well, I think maybe one way to conceptualize it is think of little pools of human capital in different parts of the world, and some of them are greater and some of them are worse. But the issue is, how do you reduce the friction enough to tap into those pools?
Yeah.
So I'm sure that people in central India have pools of just enormous human capital, extremely well-educated people, literacy rates through the roof, but if they can't reach a market, if they're stuck by bad infrastructure, for example, if they're stuck by poor internet connection, you're never going to know. All right. Similarly, like Cuba, we've talked about Cuba positively in the past. Cuba is a really outlier example. By the way, higher life expectancy than the U.S.
Well, they have a great healthcare system.
Yeah, they do.
And some people are going to get angry at me for saying, "Oh, you're repeating Cuban government propaganda." They do. They just do. Sorry.
They do. I mean, it's a human capital, and it's not like whatever. It's not about the Cuban government. This is applauding the Cuban people. But relative to their income, they're an enormous outlier on the human capital scale. They're well-educated, they're healthy, all of these things. And this is really becoming more important because of technology. So one of the great things, as you point out, about the US is, we've always had a lot of human capital. We're a huge developed country. We have some of the best human capital in the world, but also we enjoy the lowest friction. And that was always our great advantage. We're the beacon to the scientists all over the world. The people from whatever country is a basket case and has a lot of smart people at the moment, whether it be Austria pre-Anschluss or, India in the 1980s, they want to come here. And the best people want to come here, as you point out. So the friction was always very low in the US, and that allowed us to punch way above our weight. But now I think if you look at the next 10 years and you look at a few trends, the first one is work from home and remote working that actually works, that people can do. That's a huge one, because now increasingly you can live anywhere and you can do any job. Mm-hmm. And that's an overstatement. There's frictions in that still, but that's the direction that we're moving in at the margin. And you read these anecdotes about software engineers in Istanbul who work for US-based companies, or people who work for Infosys in India who don't like their job and they're moonlighting for US startup companies. That is where the future is going. Good people all over the world, that's going to be their opportunity set opening up in a way like it never has before. The other big technology, in addition to the remote work, is translation. We're only just starting to see the glimmers of this, and everyone's focused on ChatGPT and large language models and, AI applications now. But translation, the friction of translation is going to really decrease. So even people who are not native English speakers, which right now it benefits weird little niche places. Last week we talked about the Philippines. Mm-hmm. I worry for the Philippines, in part because a lot of their advantages are going to be eroded away in terms of services exports, native English speaking ability, those sorts of things. And AI and translation, is going to flow like water and really contribute to that. So relative to the high performing, high human capital areas of the world, I think the US is going to enjoy less of an advantage, because the technology that, ironically, US companies have helped to create and propagate throughout the world is reducing those frictions for everyone else. You don't have to leave Istanbul. You don't have to go to Silicon Valley. You don't have to leave Central India. A lot of people will, but hundreds of thousands of people are not going to. And what are those people going to do? They're going to stay where they are, take advantage of lower frictions, and start killing it. Which is why I think, when you're analyzing countries like this, you really have to start segmenting into different groups. Because as much as, the barriers are going up on trading physical goods, barriers on services are going down, from what I can see. And that's a really, really exciting development.
Well, that raises a question for me then, which is, because my impulse, or impulse is the wrong word, but based on what you're saying, I would think that and tell me if I'm wrong here. I feel like what you're saying lays out an argument for why, and I'm going to take this now sort of to a more cerebral investment. Like, let's not get, I don't want us to go into the policy hobby horse, which we're never really in danger of doing that. But to think about it sort of clinically, like, it seems to me that you're laying out an argument for companies or people or countries that make things should do well in this world that we're envisioning here. I mean, like, that's sort of a derivative of saying that the companies or countries that have good human capital are going to do well going forward. So how do you, like, if you're thinking about this from an investment perspective, like you've laid out this human capital problem in the United States, does that tell you that you want to be looking at companies that are going to, lead the U.S. manufacturing renaissance, who want to bring manufacturing back here and are willing to stick their necks out and pay the money to bring jobs back here and do all that other sort of thing? Is that going to be cost ineffective? Do you want to go to those peripheral places around the world that can do that sort of thing, that have resources and access to energy and young human capital that is hungry enough to make these sacrifices and do those sorts of things? Like, how does the insight that you've got here in human capital make you think about sort of where you're allocating capital over the next even 12 months, 18 months?
I think you need to differentiate between trading things and trading services, because we've talked a lot about trading things and sort of, the multipolar thesis, creating alliances with like-minded countries and, rejiggering your supply chains to be centered around those countries. Like, I don't think this changes any of that thesis. I think it really shows up in services. And that's a much squishier thing. So it's less geographically focused. I think that would be the big takeaway, is like, traditionally services were the most geographically focused. That's why, the people in the US who weren't making things anymore were taking care of sick people or making food, which literally you can't ship around the world because that cannot be outsourced, right? And services were traditionally like that. And I just think that's going to be much less the case. So even if you're a landlocked country, even if you're Uzbekistan and you have 17 countries surrounding you on every side, and you're on a big flat plain, I think that's okay from a services standpoint, because you're really it's going to be a much more open playing field, I think. And I don't know if there's any big picture takeaways like, oh, this country is going to do great or this country is going to do bad, other than looking at the countries that have a lot of human capital: India, Cuba, southern Brazil, places like that, or regions even like that, and looking at ways that they can unlock that human capital by using lower friction global markets for services more.
Yeah, to push back against that, though, I mean, because for that to happen, to what's the word I should use there? To de-geographize like services and things like that, you do need lots of mobile infrastructure and things like that. And the way the economy works right now, there's not one country that does all these things. So, I mean, semiconductors is the great example. The fabs are in Taiwan, and the photoresist is in Japan, and the memory is in South Korea, and the lithography equipment is in the Netherlands, and the United States is really good at software design. If suddenly all those global supply chains start to break apart, all the devices and things that offer such promise for the future of 5G and super fast, and you can actually feel like you can be in one place or another. The metaverse makes me want to light myself on fire, but the idea behind the metaverse and that you can be anywhere, that all requires a lot of mobile and digital infrastructure that hasn't been built yet, and which I think people are assuming we're going to build it with the old techniques. But at the same time, all these different countries are now suddenly those supply chains are not greased as much anymore. Now, the flip side of that is, you probably saw this, even with the United States trade war, even with the balloon, even with all the problems in U.S.-China relations, trade between them hit a record this year, $690 billion worth of trade between China and the United States. So maybe it's much ado about nothing, and we're still going to keep trading with each other until some country can figure out how to create the ecosystem that it needs to do this. But I do think the unleashing of human capital by the forces of globalization, as we move away from globalization, it will also prevent human capital from, it'll increase friction of human capital, I guess is what I'm saying, if I'm going to put it in your words.
Maybe if things get really bad, like really, really bad. What I mean by that is, like, the friction is always most present and most obvious in the world of physical goods, physically moving stuff around, trading it, creating value chains of things. And the friction in services is usually cultural, linguistic habits. It's just not normal if you're going to hire someone for your business to be, a web designer or be a lawyer. You're not going to go, oh, let's go look on, Indeed.com in Mongolia and see who's there. Like, you just don't do that. Those are the big frictions. And I could see a case where if you do get more fragmentation, you do get, barriers coming up in the physical world, that could increase the frictions in the non-physical world. But that would have to be, to introduce new barriers like that based purely, like, for example, if we got to the point in the US where no American company would hire a Chinese national just because, like, hey, they're just bad guys. That would be an example, I think, of, if I understand what you're saying correctly, of the barriers in the physical world shifting into the services world in a way that they haven't before. And that would be very bad. But I don't think we're there yet. Like, when you lay out your scenario of, I think the next 10 years, we're going to look back as the golden age. And then after that, the shit's going to hit the fan. I think we're in shit hitting the fan territory when we talk about those kinds of barriers coming up. And they're going to be much more offset by the technology improvements that we have seen and are continuing to see.
I think we're a little closer with China than you think, because there were U.S. tech executives who, with all those semiconductor restrictions, couldn't do the things they wanted to do. There were restrictions on what companies you could work for if you were in China, and people trying to get out of China. But I take your point that it's a little early for exactly that sort of thing. It's also very China specific. It's also why, and I actually didn't say this in the rant because I wanted to focus on the sort of what would the balloons see in the United States thing. But the other part of the rant that I didn't put in, which I would just put here because it relates to what you're saying, is there was something really sinister and red scary and almost 19th century about how the media decided to cover it. And it was every part of the media. It wasn't just Fox News. It was CNN and MSNBC and even the liberals frothing at the mouth about this Chinese spy balloon. And it's like, you don't think the United States spies on countries all the time? You don't think we have satellites and spycraft and all sorts of other things that are, this is the game. This is the game of international relations. This shouldn't be such a big surprise. And there have been balloons in the past. Apparently there's another balloon already. There was something, and for some reason maybe it's because of China's size. I can't quite explain it, but China has been a recurring boogeyman for the United States for centuries. In the 19th century, it was, Chinese immigrants to the United States were treated really, really poorly and were used as fodder for dangerous industries and all these other sorts of things. The United States security apparatus, part of the reason the United States went to Vietnam was because the Democrats, I said this on the podcast with Marco that's coming out next week, the Democrats were so pissed off about losing China to the communists under Roosevelt and Truman that they're like, we can't let Vietnam go there too. So in some ways, the original sin of the Vietnam War is this weird primordial fear about China, and China being this long-term competitor and rival with the United States. And the other part I would say is, my thesis about the multipolar world, and these being the good years, that's only if the multipolar world exists. The United States right now is trying to make this another Cold War. We're trying to make this a bipolar conflict where it's everybody in the world versus China. And if that actually, I don't think that's going to work, but it's certainly a possible scenario. And if you get there, we're basically taking the world's largest factory and largest commodity consumer for the past 20 years and saying, you're off the table. We're going to redo everything really, really quickly. And that's going to be bad for most people in the world.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine that we would do that latter scenario that you play out. Like, am I just naive? Like, when you actually have the big barriers going up and China is completely isolated, they're so integrated in everything. Like, I think we've had this conversation before, and I always quote the dead Kennedys: "Give me convenience or give me death." Like, that is the American motto. Like, how many washer dryers that are 12 weeks behind does it take before elected politicians need to change their tune?
Apparently a lot. But I mean, to your point, I don't want to do a reducto ad absurdum, but I mean, nobody imagined that World War I was going to happen. And everybody thought at the time that because there were such important trade dependencies and linkages between all of these different geopolitical rivals, they thought that the economic logic would override it. And the reason geopolitics works is because, and it doesn't always work, because sometimes the economics do trump geopolitics. And that's why, you and I have such a fruitful partnership. And it's why I'm very cautious about making really strong statements, because I understand that geopolitics is just one variable. And sometimes it's the main variable, but sometimes it's not. But I mean, sometimes the geopolitics trumps the economics. And when that happens, things do get really kind of scary. So, I mean, it's there. We've done this before. We're sort of repeating ourselves in this sense. I don't know why. Like, we don't have to repeat these tropes if we don't want to. We could just focus on, making the United States a little stronger, a little better. But I said this to my friend who wrote in that email too. If you go and read the famous George Kennan telegram about the Soviet Union that sort of created the logic for the containment policy, most people think of it in terms of, Kennan and containment and, blocking the Soviet Union from spreading communism around the world. The real substance of that telegram is the United States should really double down on itself, on its infrastructure, on civil liberties, on bowling associations, and the things that we do with each other, because a stronger society leads to more human capital, leads to a model that everybody wants to come to, because the Soviet Union had a fake propagandized version of what life was like in the Soviet Union, but in reality it was grim, it was terrible. Like, you didn't actually enjoy music and art and all these other sorts of things. I mean, I'm generalizing a little bit, but we do seem to have our heads stuck a little bit back in the, let's not worry about the problems here. Let's try and blame others for the problems that we have. And if we fix the China thing, then of course, like, the United States will rise and get back to it. Like, we've been neglecting our human capital for a long time, and it's not just us. I think the situation is worse in the United States than in other places. But in some sense, most of the world has been neglecting human capital because we were happy to let cheap Chinese labor build the computer that we're podcasting on and the phone that I'll use to text you later about, whatever I find online later tonight that scares me out. I mean, like, all that stuff is because, we use cheap Chinese labor for convenience.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there. It's striking because yesterday I went to Chambord, the chateau in the Loire River Valley. And if you go to the chateau, which is a very weird, very interesting place, by the way, and I recommend it, there's a whole thing, because I didn't realize this. It was the staging ground for all of the art that they evacuated from all of France's museums when the Nazis were coming. So Chambord was the distribution center, so to speak, for every artwork that they took out of Paris, everywhere in the Nazis' path. But the thing that was the most depressing about the story was that they started putting the plans in place in 1934. Like, the fact that they could just see what was coming so clearly, that they had like, okay, well, the barbarians are going to be here eventually, so let's start, packaging up and make sure we have enough bubble wrap for the Mona Lisa. I don't know why I tell that story, but I happened to be there yesterday. But I found it very depressing, just the notion. And man, this is turning into a real downer of a podcast, by the way. But just the notion that you can see things coming like a slow motion train wreck, and even if you recognize them, in many cases you can't do anything to stop them. That's the pessimistic view. What's the optimistic view, Jacob?
You need the optimistic view? I mean, the optimistic view, and there is an optimistic view here, which is that great challenges sort of create the opportunity for incredible innovation and for overcoming challenges and things like that. So, I mean, I said this in the Balloon podcast, like the horrors of World War I, the excesses of the 1920s. Eventually, things get so bad in the United States that people stop arguing with each other, and the New Deal comes in, and the United States government spends a bunch of money on things that the market wouldn't have otherwise spent money on. So things like rural electrification is sort of the biggest one. But you go down, like in some ways, we're still using the infrastructure that boom in the early 1930s and mid 1930s created. You get World War II on top of it and the whole military-industrial complex, and that's literally why the United States is the great power it is, because things got really, really bad, and the United States had the human capital to overcome in a way that most places in the world didn't. You could say probably the same thing about the 1980s. I'm sure that there are people on this podcast who probably hate Roosevelt and think the New Deal was basically communism. If you're listening to this podcast and you're one of those, the flip side of that is Reagan in the 1980s responds to stagflation by unleashing American confidence again and unleashing sort of American business. And you can argue about the ways that policy wasn't great, but out of the 80s comes the collapse of the Soviet Union. You show how decrepit that or a society actually was, and you get the 90s and all the music that I wish I could put at the. I can't. Did you listen to the podcast on Monday? I asked Jacob if we could put in Black Balloon from the Goo Goo Dolls as the intro. I wasn't sure if he actually was able to do it or not for copyright concerns. Anyway, but it was in there. Great. Anybody who was coming of age in the 90s would recognize that song and would feel like warm inside at the nostalgic I'm trying to give the people the optimistic point of view here, but you're listening to the Dead Kennedys and stuff like that. So anyway, the optimistic view though is that, look, we're at the end of an era, we're sort of at the end of a generation. Things are going to get bad, but as we identify these problems, people are going to rise up and they're going to fix some of these problems. And it's in some ways like this is a nice corrective to the podcast we did with Miles at the beginning of the week, because Miles was basically saying, hey, nuclear fusion, it's here in our lifetimes, like cheap, safe, inexhaustible sources of energy, literally the holy grail for physicists for over 100 years. It's here. We just need a couple trillion in material science, engineering, and some advances there, and we're ready to rock and roll. We had one listener who pointed out people were saying the same things about fusion 20 years ago. I wouldn't know because I wasn't listening to things about fusion 20 years ago, so maybe it is. But that there's an amazing sort of sense of optimism there that I think we do sort of have to come back with. Even though we've had all this technological progress, there are these problems, and where you get from sort of where the problems are today to applying the cool technology to the problems that are going to arise here over the next couple of years, like that's going to be kind of difficult. And it goes back to, it was amazing how many people asked for the Peter Zeihan rebuttal in last week's podcast. But one of the main differences that I have with Peter and a lot of other geopolitical analysts is, as you said, I feel great about the next couple of years. There's going to be so much opportunity over the next couple of years as people latch onto these problems and figure out how to solve them. That's going to create amazing things. The problem is going to be once that starts to become a source of competition, and once we don't need each other so much, or once a country like a China or even an India or a Germany or a Russia decides it can start doing things without recourse to what other countries are going to force in on them. So I'm fairly optimistic about the next couple of years, but terrified about what happens a decade on. Whereas I feel like the normal consensus view is, oh God, things are so terrible right now. If we can just get through sort of the next couple of years, we'll be okay. I really do think it's the inverse there. And it's why, whether you're investing, whether you're building supply chains, whether you're thinking about, your own investment. And I'm thinking about this very personally from educating a daughter and bringing children into the world. Like now's the time to make moves. I think the time not to make moves is probably coming. And the other flip side of that is that's a forecast. I'll be around. Well, hopefully I'll be around long enough to see whether I was right or not. So in 10 years, I'll be able to say I'm not just throwing something out here and then I'm going to go away and not talk about it anymore. So you'll be able to hold my feet to the fire on that too. So that's the best source of optimism I could bring to you. It's that we have all the things we need to overcome these problems. None of these problems are insurmountable. It's just about developing the political will to do so. But in order to have political will to do so, things have to get bad enough that people put aside the stupid issues like the balloons and say, hey, we kind of need to work together on this stuff because there's no company or no country in today's world that can do this stuff alone. That's just not going to work. So it's who can build the coalition that actually solves the problems. And whichever countries or companies or groups of people do that, they will have tremendous success.
I think that's a good way to put it. And as much as sometimes we go on about the bad things here, and doom and gloom gets ears listening, it's just not the reality. I think your base case always has to be optimism. And I know ours is, and mine is. It's just a funny thing because, as you point out, the way the U.S. works, as Winston Churchill said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing once they've tried everything else. And it's true, because we don't focus our minds on the problems until they're really, really bad. And maybe someday we'll go so far off the rails that we really genuinely can't fix them. But all of these things are fixable, eminently fixable. And even when you talk about the human capital things, so oh no, we don't have anyone who can do this part of the semiconductor supply chain because we don't know how to do it. Or, Miles saying, no one's known how to do that part of nuclear engineering for 50 years. Well, Miles got educated in 7 years. We built a Miles in 7 years.
Yeah.
If we want to, we can have armies of Miles. No, my point is, even seemingly the most intractable human capital problems, things change quickly. And I think that's the lesson of U.S. history, is that we have a remarkable capability to do that when we want to.
Well, sort of 2 points on that. This is never going to happen, the scenario that I'm tracing for you. But one of the things that's in the SITREP this week is that the Nicaraguan government just apparently randomly decided they wanted to release over 200 political prisoners to the United States. So they're just getting them out of Nicaragua. They're going to come to the United States. And the reason is apparently they want to try and use it as a signal to improve relations with the United States. You and I have said this on the podcast many, many times. If the United States government could figure out how to deal with Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba in some kind of pragmatic way and accept okay, ideologically, these governments are terrible and are led by thugs. But let's say we bring in U.S. education and technology at the lower level and play the long game here. And let's teach a generation of Cubans and Venezuelans and Nicaraguans things that they actually need to participate in the modern economy. That's how much human capital is just sitting there being wasted behind ideological barriers. And I'm not going to throw blame at either side. The Venezuelan government is reprehensible. I'm not going to come here and say we should whitewash the Venezuelan government. I'm just saying, there are pockets of human capital that you could really use, U.S. ingenuity and U.S. education to really grow. The second thing, but this gets to your point about, we have all the things that we need. This was an article in Science this week, and we can maybe close on this. It was about avian flu. If you've been trying to buy eggs at the store and not able to find them, or they're charging you $14 for a carton of eggs, you've probably now heard of avian flu. And what's really, the article was terrifying because they said there have actually been some outbreaks now in mink farms in Spain. And apparently when you go from birds to now we're in minks, now we're starting to is it going to get to pigs? And then is it going to jump to humans? We're going from birds to mammals like us kind of really fast. And this one is more transmissible. It's more deadly. The mortality rate on avian flus can be 50, 60% or something like that. So, this terrifying article. But then the New York Times summary of the article, it says all of that crazy stuff. And I'm afraid, and I'm oh my God, COVID was just preparation for this next terrible pandemic. I've also been watching The Last of Us on HBO, which hasn't helped. So I'm like, having nightmares about fungi that are taking over my brain. But then the New York Times has an article that reviews this article in Science and throws in at the end, by the way, there are already multiple vaccines for avian flu. And there's a plan in the United States to produce 150 million doses within 6 months of a pandemic being declared. And it's like, there's like two things to say there. There's like, oh, we already have vaccines. Oh, we can produce 150 million if we decide to. This thing is moving now. Like, why haven't we been talking about, like producing the 150 million doses right now? That seems to me exactly the sort of thing that government should do. It's not cost effective to do that. But if this is actually a threat, if it's jumping to minks, like we already just saw this with COVID, why are we not doing this? And then another part of the article that was fascinating, and Rob, I feel like we need to do field research on this. Most of the vaccines, so they're not mRNA vaccines. Most of them are produced in the normal way of incubating each dose of a vaccine inside of a chicken egg. And apparently the United States keeps legions of chickens that are guarded by, like, I don't know if it's the US military or the US Poultry Protection Force. I don't know who's out there protecting these chickens and these eggs so that we can grow vaccines in case something really bad happens. But apparently there is like a strategic reserve of chickens and eggs that can be used to produce all these things. So I'm being slightly silly there, but like that article, like reading that Science article and then doing a little bit of research and going from the, oh my God, there's a pandemic that really might kill like many, many millions of more people and is really present with us right now. We're already seeing the impacts. Oh, we already have a vaccine. Oh, we like have chickens that are guarded by dudes with guns, and we're not producing the vaccine, even though it's starting to jump to mammals that are closer to our like respiratory systems. Like all of that to me is a nice microcosm of, how we have our heads on backwards.
But there's a darkest before the dawn phenomenon, I think, in the U.S. often. And have you ever heard of the book, The Paranoid Style in American Politics? Who wrote that?
I don't know.
Anyway, it's a fairly well-known book, but it's about the subject of the title, and you can imagine. But just, our insecurity, I think, gets worse right before things tend to get better because of that self-correcting mechanism.
Yeah.
So I, for one, as I said, for the record, am wildly optimistic about the future. And for a lot of those reasons that I said. And if we actually start addressing some of these problems, then wow, that would be even better. But
well, I think that's the takeaway, right? Like in some ways, our entire strategy is find the companies and entrepreneurs and people that are addressing these problems. And if people aren't addressing these problems, find entrepreneurs who are willing to, and connect the human capital to actual capital and like kind of see where you can go. Because we are in a world right now where the old technological innovation, it's old and stale. Like the people that are really going to make returns are the ones that are identifying the problems of the future, rather than, to your point, using the same medicine on the problem of the past and expecting a similar result. It's no longer demand side. It's no longer the Soviet Union. It's no longer communism versus capitalism. It's a whole different host of problems, and there are tools out there to use them. And the ones that can shake the cobwebs out of their brain to attack it, there's a lot of potential there to do good stuff.
Yep. And hanging out in Cambridge, Massachusetts is a good way to see a lot of that going on, for sure.
Yeah, it's not a good way to see that? Caring about the balloon or eating too much sugar. So I'll close out on that. And we'll see y'all next week.
On the subject of human capital, I'm going to go pick up my baby boy and be optimistic about the future.
Sounds good. Tell him I say hello. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.